BP is dropping, 60/40 and falling, the anesthesiologist shrieked, his voice cracking as the monitors erupted into a symphony of frantic, high-pitched alarms. Blood welled up in the surgical cavity far faster than the suction tube could clear it, a terrifying crimson tide hiding the fatal tear. Richard's hands, renowned across the state for their unshakable precision, trembled as he blindly searched the slippery abyss for the ruptured artery. "I can't see it. Suction! Give me another clamp, damn it!" he yelled, the brilliant golden boy chief of surgery finally breaking under the impossible pressure. The heart monitor let out a continuous, flatlining wail. The patient was slipping away. Suddenly, the heavy operating room doors kicked open. A figure clad in hospital scrubs and hastily donned sterile gloves pushed past the paralyzed circulating nurse. "Move your hands, doctor, or he bleeds out in 10 seconds, a calm, terrifyingly authoritative voice commanded. Richard looked up, his eyes wide above his surgical mask. It was Lauren, the night shift janitor. Chapter 1. The Invisible Woman. To the world of St. Jude's Medical Center, Lauren was nothing more than a ghost in blue polyester. She existed in the periphery of the bustling hospital, a silent shadow accompanied by the squeak of rubber-soled shoes and the rhythmic, hypnotic slosh of a wet mop. She was 34, though the silver streaks woven prematurely through her dark hair and the deep, tired lines around her hazel eyes made her look older. She kept her head down, her gaze fixed entirely on the scuff marks marring the pristine white linoleum, and spoke only when spoken to, which was rare. Doctors did not look at janitors. They looked through them. They stepped over her wet floor signs with irritated sighs, discarding their coffee cups and bloody gauze without a second thought, assuming the magic of the custodial staff would simply spirit the mess away. Lauren preferred it this way. Invisibility was her armor. It was safe. It demanded no decisions, held no lives in the balance, and most importantly, it offered no chance for anyone to die in her hands. It was 2 a.m. on a damp Tuesday when she pushed her heavy yellow cart past Trauma Bay 3. The sliding glass doors were cracked open, emitting the chaotic symphony of a failing human body. "I need a chest tube, now." "He's developing tension." Lauren recognized the voice instantly. It was Richard, Dr. Richard Evans. At 38, he was the youngest chief of trauma in the hospital's history, a man whose reputation for surgical miracles was matched only by his formidable, often intimidating ego. He was tall, with sharp patrician features, usually drawn into a tight scowl of intense concentration. Lauren paused, her hands resting lightly on the rough plastic handle of her mop. She peered through the narrow gap in the glass. The patient, a young man involved in a motorcycle accident, was cyanotic, his lips taking on a terrible, bruised shade of blue. His chest was rising unevenly. Richard was standing over him, demanding a scalpel, his eyes locked on the right side of the patient's chest. From her vantage point, 20 feet away, Lauren's eyes didn't rest on the dramatic rise and fall of the chest. They darted to the monitor, registering the specific waveform of the pulse oximeter, then tracked down to the distended jugular veins bulging against the patient's neck, and finally to the subtle, almost imperceptible shift of the trachea to the right. It's not the right side, Lauren thought, the clinical observation firing through her brain with the speed of a bullet. The trachea is deviated right. The tension is on the left. The impact must have contused the left lung, causing a delayed rupture. Scalpel to the right fifth intercostal. Richard ordered the resident beside him, preparing to cut. Lauren's grip on the mop handle tightened until her knuckles turned white. A bead of cold sweat rolled down her spine. If he cut into the healthy right lung, the patient would lose all respiratory function instantly. He would code before they could flip to the other side. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. "Say something," her instincts screamed. "You know what this is. You've seen this 100 times in the dust." She took a half step forward. The squeak of her shoe echoed in the quiet hallway. But then, the memories slammed into her. The blinding sun of the Syrian desert, the deafening roar of a mortar shell, the feeling of a soldier's blood soaking through her uniform as she desperately, futilely tried to pack a wound that could not be packed. The subsequent tribunal, the faces of men in suits telling her that her battlefield improvisations were unorthodox and negligent. She froze. The mop handle felt like lead. She was not a surgeon anymore. She was a janitor. She had no right to speak. Just as Richard pressed the cold steel of the scalpel to the patient's right side, an older attending physician rushed into the bay, glanced at the portable X-ray that had just flashed onto the screen, and shouted, "Stop! Evans, look at the film. Tracheal deviation. It's the left side." Richard halted, the blade millimeters from the skin. He looked up, his eyes widening in a rare moment of realized error. "Switch sides," he barked, covering his near-fatal mistake with a surge of aggressive action. "Left side, move." Lauren exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her shoulders slumped, the adrenaline draining away to leave a cold, hollow ache in her chest. She dipped her mop back into the bucket, watching the water turn murky with the hospital's dirt. She wrung it out, the mechanical action soothing her fraying nerves, and moved on down the hall. She had almost intervened. She had almost broken her one rule. As she scrubbed a dried speck of blood from the baseboards, a single tear escaped her eye, mingling with the chemical sting of the bleach. She wasn't saving lives anymore. She was just cleaning up the aftermath. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Past. The doctor's lounge was a sanctuary of faux leather couches, stale coffee, and the heavy scent of exhaustion. It was Lauren's last stop before her shift ended at 6 a.m. Usually, the room was empty at this hour, allowing her to wipe down the tables and restock the dreadful vending machine in peace. Tonight, however, as she pushed her cart through the swinging doors, she found Richard sitting on the edge of the furthest sofa, his head buried in his hands. His green scrubs were wrinkled, and a faint smattering of dried, rust-colored blood stained his left sleeve. Lauren hesitated. Protocol dictated she should leave and come back later. But her shift was almost over, and her supervisor, a notoriously strict man named Miller, would dock her pay if the checklist wasn't completed. Moving as quietly as a phantom, she began wiping down the counters on the opposite side of the room, spraying an ungodly amount of citrus-scented disinfectant to mask the smell of burnt coffee. Richard groaned softly, rubbing his temples. He looked up, his bloodshot eyes struggling to focus on her. "You don't have to be so quiet," he mumbled, his voice hoarse from yelling orders all night. "I'm awake." "Just trying to do my job, Dr. Evans," Lauren replied softly, keeping her back to him. Her voice was slightly raspy, a permanent souvenir of smoke inhalation from a burning medical tent 5 years prior. Richard sighed, leaning back against the sofa. "Do you ever look at this place and wonder how we keep it all together?" he asked, not really expecting an answer from the cleaning staff, but simply needing to vocalize the crushing weight on his chest. "That kid tonight. The motorcycle. I almost cut the wrong side. If Dr. Eris hadn't walked in." He trailed off, the admission of failure bitter on his tongue. Lauren paused, her cloth hovering over a stained mug. She knew she shouldn't engage. She was meant to be invisible. But the raw vulnerability in the arrogant surgeon's voice snagged on a hidden, empathetic corner of her heart. "Tunnel vision," Lauren said quietly. Richard blinked, startled by the clinical term coming from the woman in the blue polyester smock. "Excuse me?" Lauren turned slightly, her gaze fixed on the floor between them. When the adrenaline spikes, the brain narrows its focus to the most immediate perceived threat. You saw the bruising on the right side, your brain locked onto it, and you shut out the peripheral data, the trachea, the monitor. It happens to the best. It's a physiological response to combat stress. Richard stared at her, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Combat stress? It was a trauma bay, not a battlefield. Lauren offered a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Trauma is trauma, doctor. The body doesn't know the difference between a car crash in Chicago and an IED in Kabul. It just knows it's bleeding." She turned back to the counter, quickly finishing her wiping. She could feel his eyes boring into her back, analyzing her, dissecting her words. She had said too much. The slip of the tongue was dangerous. "Where did you learn about tunnel vision?" Richard asked, his tone shifting from exhausted to intensely curious. He stood up, taking a step toward her. "I read a lot," Lauren lied smoothly, grabbing the handle of her cart. "Have a good morning, Dr. Evans." She pushed past him, eager to escape the suffocating scrutiny of his gaze. As she walked down the hall, her heart beat a frantic rhythm. She needed to be more careful. The past was a locked box, and she had just handed a brilliant, inquisitive surgeon the key. Back in the small, windowless basement room she rented, Lauren stood before her bathroom mirror. She unbuttoned her pajama top, letting it fall off her shoulders. The harsh overhead light illuminated the jagged, angry starburst of a scar that marred her left shoulder shrapnel from a secondary explosive device. She traced the raised pink tissue with a trembling finger. Major Lauren Hayes. The name felt alien to her now. She closed her eyes, and the memories rushed in, unbidden and violent. The smell of cordite and copper. The rhythmic thwup 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 of the medevac choppers. The faces of the boys she couldn't save, their eyes wide and terrified in the dim red light of the surgical tent. She opened her eyes, staring at the tired, broken woman in the mirror. She was Lauren the janitor now. It was safer this way. But as she crawled into her narrow bed, the ghost of the scalpel in Richard's hand haunted her, and she knew, with a sinking feeling, that her carefully constructed wall of anonymity was beginning to crack. Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. The following week, the atmosphere in Chicago turned oppressive. A massive cold front collided with unseasonably warm air, breeding a violent, sprawling supercell that darkened the mid-morning sky to a bruised, apocalyptic purple. The air pressure dropped so rapidly that Lauren could feel the ache in her shrapnel scar, a built-in barometer that never lied. By 2 p.m., the storm broke. Rain fell in solid, punishing sheets, turning the interstate into a blinding slip-and-slide. At St. Jude's, the tension in the emergency department was palpable. Nurses restocked crash carts with frantic energy. Residents paced the floors, checking their pagers. They all knew what weather like this meant. At 2:45 p.m., the overhead klaxon sounded a harsh, blaring siren that cut through the hospital noise like a physical blow. Code Yellow. Mass casualty incident. All available personnel to the emergency department. Code Yellow. Lauren was buffing the floor in the pediatrics wing when the alarm struck. She immediately powered down the heavy machine, her instincts sharpening instantly. A code yellow meant chaos. It meant blood on the floors, biohazard spills, and a desperate need for the custodial staff to keep the pathways clear so doctors wouldn't slip while running with gurneys. She pushed her supply cart toward the elevators, her stomach tying itself into familiar, tight knots. When the elevator doors opened onto the ground floor, she was hit by a wall of sound and controlled panic. The ER doors had been blown wide open. Paramedics were rushing in, their yellow slickers dripping water and blood onto the linoleum. 50-car pileup on the I-90, a paramedic shouted over the din, pushing a gurney bearing a woman with a crushed pelvis. Visibility was zero, a semi-jackknifed, and everyone just kept piling into it. We've got dozens incoming. Richard stood at the epicenter of the storm, a clipboard in his hand, acting as the triage conductor. He was magnificent in his element, sharp, decisive, and terrifyingly focused. You, take her to Bay 1. Page ortho, he barked, pointing. Next, what do we have? Lauren moved to the periphery, grabbing her heavy-duty industrial mop and a bucket of concentrated bleach solution. Her job was to trail behind the gurneys, swiping up the trails of blood and rainwater so the trauma teams had safe footing. As she worked, slipping seamlessly between the panicked nurses and shouting doctors, she fell into an old, deeply ingrained mental state. The chaos around her began to slow down. She wasn't just looking at the floor. Her eyes were scanning the patients as they rolled past. Blunt force trauma to the chest, paradoxical breathing flail chest, she noted silently, as a man gasped for air. Pale, diaphoretic, tachycardic internal bleeding, likely splenic rupture, she diagnosed another. She was mopping near Triage Station 4 when a frantic EMT wheeled in a young girl, no older than 12. The girl was silent, her eyes rolled back, skin paper white. Pediatric, found unconscious in the back seat, the EMT yelled to a frazzled second-year resident. Pulse is thready, pressure is tanking. No obvious external bleeding. The resident, a young woman named Sarah, looked overwhelmed. She grabbed an ultrasound probe, smearing gel across the girl's abdomen, searching for internal bleeding. I don't see fluid in the belly, Sarah stammered, her hands shaking. Where is she bleeding from? Lauren, sweeping her mop in slow, deliberate arcs just 3 feet away, looked at the girl. She saw the distended neck veins. She noticed the muffled heart sounds barely audible over the screaming ER. She saw the faint, dark bruising across the sternum, where a seatbelt had violently arrested her forward momentum. Cardiac tamponade, Lauren realized with sickening certainty. The sac around the girl's heart was filling with blood, crushing the organ, preventing it from beating. "Get me an attending!" Sarah cried out, looking wildly around the packed ER. But every attending, including Richard, was elbow-deep in critical patients. They were completely on their own. "She's bradycardic, heart rate dropping to 40, a nurse shouted. Lauren's knuckles turned white on the mop handle. The girl was going to die in the next 60 seconds if the pressure wasn't relieved. A pericardiocentesis was needed immediately, a long needle driven straight into the chest to drain the blood from around the heart. It was a terrifying, delicate procedure, one that a panicked resident would likely botch. Lauren closed her eyes, the face of an Afghan child, bleeding out in her arms while she waited for a medevac that never came, flashed behind her eyelids. No, Lauren thought, not today, not this one. She dropped the mop. Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. Lauren stepped into Triage Station 4, her presence completely ignored by the frantic resident and the focused nurse. She didn't hesitate. She moved with the predatory grace of a combat veteran under fire. She reached past the trembling resident, her gloved hands moving with blinding speed. She snatched a chlorhexidine swab from the tray and viciously scrubbed the skin just below the girl's sternum. "Hey, what are you doing?" Sarah shrieked, finally noticing the janitor intruding on her patient. "Get away from her!" Lauren didn't look up. Her eyes were locked on the anatomical landmarks. She grabbed a massive, 6-inch 1/8 gauge spinal needle from the trauma cart, attaching it to a 20cc syringe. "Security!" Sarah yelled, stepping forward to physically shove Lauren away. "If you touch me, she dies," Lauren snapped, her voice dropping an octave, echoing with an absolute, terrifying authority that froze the young doctor in her tracks. It was the voice of a commanding officer, a voice that had orchestrated life and death in the most chaotic environments on Earth. Lauren angled the needle perfectly, just to the left of the xiphoid process, aiming precisely toward the left shoulder. She didn't rely on an ultrasound machine. She relied on muscle memory and the tactile feedback of the needle passing through tissue. She felt the distinct pop as the needle breached the pericardial sac. Instantly, she pulled back on the plunger, the syringe filled with dark, non-clotting blood. "Monitor," Lauren commanded, not looking away from the needle. The nurse, operating on pure instinct in the face of Lauren's overwhelming authority, looked at the screen. "Heart rate is... It's climbing. 70. 80. Pressure is coming up. 90. Over 60. The young girl on the table took a sudden, deep, ragged breath, her chest expanding as the crushed heart was suddenly allowed to beat freely. Color began to slowly seep back into her pale cheeks. Lauren extracted 30 cubic centimeters of blood, stabilizing the immediate crisis. She withdrew the needle in one smooth motion, slapping a sterile dressing over the tiny puncture wound. The immediate threat was over, but the girl still needed emergency surgery to repair the cardiac tear. Lauren stepped back, the adrenaline crashing over her like a physical wave. She looked at the syringe full of blood in her hand, then at the stunned, open-mouthed faces of the resident and the nurse. Reality crashed back in. She was a janitor. She had just performed a highly invasive, incredibly dangerous medical procedure without a license, without consent, and in full view of hospital staff. It was a felony. Without another word, she dropped the bloody syringe onto the metal tray, turned on her heel, picked up her mop, and melted back into the chaotic sea of the ER, disappearing before anyone could truly comprehend what had just happened. 5 minutes later, Richard pushed his way through the throngs of people toward Triage 4, having finally caught Sarah's frantic pages. "What's the situation?" he demanded, looking at the now stable girl breathing oxygen through a mask. She had a cardiac tamponade," Sarah stammered, still pale and visibly shaken. "We were losing her, Dr. Evans." Richard frowned, looking at the ultrasound machine, which was turned off, and then down at the bloody spinal needle on the tray. "You did a blind pericardiocentesis without an attending? That's incredibly risky, Sarah, but good work. You saved her life." Sarah swallowed hard, looking wildly around the ER, her eyes searching the blue-clad custodial staff in the distance. "Dr. Evans," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't do it." Richard froze. "What do you mean you didn't do it? Who did?" The janitor?" The nurse chimed in, pointing a trembling finger toward the hallway. The woman with the dark hair. "She just stepped in, grabbed the needle, and did it. She didn't even use the ultrasound. She just knew." Richard stared at the needle, then at the perfect, life-saving puncture wound on the girl's chest. The realization hit him like a physical blow. the anatomy lesson in the doctor's lounge. The cold, precise knowledge of combat trauma. Trauma is trauma, doctor. Richard turned, his eyes scanning the chaotic emergency department, looking for a flash of blue polyester. He didn't see her. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that St. Jude's was harboring a ghost, and he needed to find out who she really was. Chapter 5. Into the Red Zone. The mass casualty incident stretched late into the night. By 11 p.m., the initial chaos had subsided into a grueling marathon of surgeries. Richard had been on his feet for 18 hours, running on black coffee and adrenaline. His muscles ached, his eyes burned, but the pager clipped to his belt remained his cruel master. It buzzed frantically. Trauma 1, priority red, ETA 2 minutes. Richard rubbed his face, splashing cold water from a scrub sink onto his cheeks, before jogging down to the ambulance bay. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle. The ambulance screamed to a halt, and paramedics threw the back doors open. We have a 4-5-year-old male, driver of the semi-truck involved in the pileup, the lead paramedic shouted as they rapidly unloaded the gurney. Extrication took 3 hours. He was impaled by a piece of reinforced steel rebar from the guardrail. Richard looked at the patient and felt a cold knot form in his stomach. A thick, rusted piece of steel protruded from the man's right abdomen, exiting through his lower back. It was a catastrophic, horrific injury. The man was barely conscious, his skin the color of old parchment. BP is 70 over palpatory. Tachycardic at 140. We've pumped him full of fluids, but he's bleeding out internally, the paramedic continued as they rushed down the hallway. Get him straight to OR1. Bypass the ER, Richard ordered, his mind racing through the anatomical structures the rebar might have pulverized. Liver, intestines, kidney, and the most terrifying possibility, the inferior vena cava, the massive vein returning blood to the heart. Across the hall, Lauren was quietly emptying the biohazard bins in the scrub room, connecting OR1 and OR2. She paused as the gurney thundered past the glass doors, her eyes locking onto the rusted steel protruding from the man's gut. She felt a phantom ache in her own shoulder. Impalements were a nightmare. They were ticking time bombs. The object itself often acted as a plug, stemming the bleeding from the vessels it had severed. The moment you tried to remove it, the patient could bleed to death in seconds. Richard scrubbed in rapidly, his face a mask of grim determination. He entered OR1, where the team had already prepped and draped the patient, carefully working around the massive piece of metal. "All right, team, listen up," Richard said, his voice echoing in the sterile, brightly lit room. "We have an abdominal impalement. We are going to open him up wide, achieve proximal and distal control of the major vessels, and then, and only then, do we attempt to extract the foreign object. If the vena cava is hit, we will have seconds. Let's move." Scalpel. In the adjacent scrub room, Lauren couldn't bring herself to leave. She stood in the shadows, watching through the viewing window. She knew she should walk away. She had already risked everything in the ER. If she was caught hovering around the surgical suites, she would be fired instantly. But she couldn't tear her eyes away. She watched Richard make a massive midline incision, opening the abdomen. Blood instantly pooled, dark and menacing. "Suction! Get that blood out of there!" Richard ordered, his hands delicately navigating the mangled tissue around the rusted steel. For the first 30 minutes, the surgery proceeded with tense, agonizing precision. Richard was a master, his hands moving with fluid grace as he clamped bleeding vessels and packed off damaged sections of the bowel. He was navigating the minefield flawlessly. Then, disaster struck. As Richard was attempting to isolate the right kidney, the patient suddenly shifted. Despite the heavy anesthesia, a deep, involuntary muscle spasm racked his body. The movement was microscopic, but it was enough. The rusted rebar shifted laterally, a mere half-inch. It was like a dam bursting. A geyser of dark, venous blood erupted from deep within the abdominal cavity, instantly flooding the surgical field and overflowing onto the drapes and the floor. The monitor erupted into a chaotic cacophony of alarms. "Pressure is dropping. 50 over 30. 40 over 20. The anesthesiologist screamed. "He's crashing. I can't see. Suction. 2 suctions," Richard yelled, his voice laced with genuine panic. He plunged both hands blindly into the pool of blood, desperately trying to feel for the tear, trying to pinch off the massive hemorrhage. But the bleeding was too fast, too profound. The rebar had sheared the side of the inferior vena cava, the largest vein in the body. It was a fatal injury. "I don't have it. I can't find the tear," Richard shouted, his calm demeanor completely shattered. The blood was rising, soaking his gown. He was drowning in his failure. In the scrub room, Lauren watched the monitor flatline. She watched the golden boy of Street Jude's freeze, his hands deep in a dying man's chest, paralyzed by a situation he could not control. This wasn't a sterile hospital procedure anymore. This was a war zone. This was a man bleeding out in the dirt. The janitor died in that moment, and the combat surgeon resurrected. Lauren slammed her hands onto the scrub sink, kicking the foot pedal. The hot water blasted out. She grabbed the surgical scrub brush and attacked her hands and forearms with vicious, practiced speed. It wasn't a perfect 3-minute scrub, but it was enough. She kicked open the door to the OR. Chapter 6. The Takeover. The circulating nurse, a seasoned veteran named Martha, spun around as the door banged open. Her eyes widened in shock as the hospital janitor, clad in a damp blue polyester smock, stood in the sterile threshold, her hands dripping wet. "What are you doing in here?" Martha yelled. "Get out! You're breaking sterility. Gown me and glove me, size 7, Lauren commanded. It wasn't a request. The sheer, overwhelming force of her tone hit Martha like a physical weight. It was the voice of someone who owned the room, someone who had stared down death 1,000 times and refused to blink. Martha, operating on a bizarre, stunned instinct, grabbed a sterile gown and threw it over Lauren's shoulders, snapping the back. She held out the gloves. Lauren plunged her hands in, snapping the latex over her wrists. "Time to death, 40 seconds, Lauren stated loudly, stepping up to the operating table opposite Richard. Richard looked up, his face pale, sweat dripping from his forehead. His hands were still submerged in the patient's abdomen, uselessly searching for the tear. He stared at Lauren, his mind unable to process the impossible reality of the janitor standing across from him in sterile gear. "What the hell are you doing?" Richard stammered, his voice trembling. "Get out. Move your hands, doctor, before you kill him," Lauren said, her voice dropping to a deadly, icy calm. "I am the chief of surgery," Richard roared, a desperate attempt to reclaim control. "Security, get her out of here. You are a civilian doctor who is out of his depth, and your patient is bleeding to death," Lauren countered, leaning over the table. "You have a massive IVC avulsion. You can't see it because you're trying to clamp it. You can't clamp an avulsion of this size blindly. You'll shred the vessel. Step aside." Richard hesitated, pride battling against the terrifying realization that she was absolutely right. He was failing. The patient was dying. "Do it!" Lauren roared, the command echoing off the tile walls. Richard slowly pulled his blood-soaked hands out of the cavity, stepping back. Lauren stepped into his place. The hesitation vanished. She was back in the tent. The smell of bleach was replaced by the phantom scent of hot sand and cordite. "Give me a size 24 Foley catheter, a 50cc syringe, and heavy silk ties," Lauren barked at the scrub tech, a young man who was staring at her in open-mouthed terror. "Move!" The tech scrambled, slapping the instruments into her outstretched hand. Lauren didn't ask for suction. She didn't try to see the tear. She relied on touch. She plunged her left hand deep into the boiling lake of blood, her fingers sliding past the rigid steel of the rebar, tracing the slippery, pulsing anatomy of the spine until she felt the massive, flaccid tube of the inferior vena cava. She found the tear. It was massive, a jagged rip 3 inches long. With her right hand, she guided the flexible rubber Foley catheter deep into the pool of blood, sliding it directly into the gaping hole in the vein. "Inflate the balloon," she ordered the tech, holding the catheter steady in the dark abyss. 30 cc's of saline. "Now." The tech pushed the plunger. Deep inside the vein, the small balloon at the tip of the catheter inflated. Lauren pulled back gently on the catheter until the inflated balloon lodged firmly against the inside of the tear, acting like a cork in a leaking dam. The sheer pressure of the balloon against the interior wall of the vein instantly tamponated the bleeding. The catastrophic geyser of blood slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. "Suction," Lauren said calmly, not taking her eyes off the cavity. The nurse frantically cleared the pooled blood. As the cavity emptied, the horrific injury became visible. The massive tear in the vein was perfectly plugged by the balloon of the catheter, held taut by Lauren's left hand. The monitors, which had been flatlining, slowly began to beep again. A sluggish, weak rhythm, but a rhythm nonetheless. Pressure is... it's stabilizing. 70/40. He has a pulse, the anesthesiologist whispered, staring at Lauren, as if she were a god who had just descended from the heavens. Richard stood frozen, staring at the surgical field. He had never seen a maneuver like that. It was brutal, unorthodox, brilliant, and entirely outside the standard protocols of civilian surgery. It was a battlefield tactic, a desperate, improvised move designed to keep a soldier alive long enough to reach a hospital. Lauren looked up at him, her hazel eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying intensity. The janitor was gone. The combat surgeon had taken over the room. "The bleeding is controlled, Dr. Evans," Lauren said, her voice steady and commanding. "Now, we have to extract the metal and repair the vessel. Scrub back in. We have a lot of work to do." Chapter 7. The Dance of Blades. The atmosphere in OR1 shifted from absolute panic to a heavy, electrified silence. The impossible had happened, and everyone in the room was suspended in the shockwave of Lauren's intervention. Richard, shaking off his paralysis, stepped back to the scrub sink. He washed his hands with a renewed, frantic energy, his mind racing to comprehend the woman standing at his operating table. He regowned and stepped back to his position, feeling entirely off balance. For the first time in his celebrated career, he was no longer the lead surgeon. He was the assistant. "All right," Lauren said, her eyes fixed on the surgical field. She was a different person. The slouch was gone, replaced by a rigid, commanding posture. "The balloon is holding the pressure, but the IVC tissue is friable. We need proximal and distal vascular clamps before we can deflate and suture. Dr. Evans, I need you to dissect the tissue superior to the hepatic veins, carefully." Richard nodded, accepting a pair of DeBakey forceps and a right-angle dissector. He moved with extreme caution, acutely aware of her intense scrutiny. "It's tight," he murmured, working around the rusted steel. "The liver is contused, obscuring the field." "Use your fingers," Lauren instructed, her tone devoid of ego, purely educational. "The steel will throw shadows under the lights. Trust your tactile anatomy. Feel the pulse of the aorta to your left, trace it up, find the crus of the diaphragm." Richard did as he was told, slipping his gloved fingers into the warm, slippery cavity. He felt the rhythmic thumping of the aorta and used it as a guide, slowly separating the delicate tissue away from the massive vein. "I have it. Proximal control achieved." He applied a large, angled vascular clamp. "Good. Now distal, below the renal veins," Lauren said. She hadn't moved her left hand. She was still holding the catheter taut, acting as the human cork, keeping the patient alive. Once both clamps were secured, the blood flow to the damaged section of the vein was completely isolated. "Now for the hard part," Lauren said, glancing at the anesthesiologist. "We are going to extract the rebar. When it comes out, there may be secondary bleeding from the liver parenchyma. Be ready with mass transfusion protocols." "Ready," the anesthesiologist confirmed, his hands hovering over the IV lines. "Dr. Evans, take the steel," Lauren commanded. "Pull straight up. Do not twist. Do not lever it. Straight vertical extraction." Richard gripped the blood-slicked, rusted metal with both hands. It felt sickeningly heavy. He braced himself, his jaw tight. On 3. 1, 2, 3. He pulled. The metal slid out with a wet, grotesque sucking sound. Instantly, dark blood began to well up from the liver, but the main vein remained secure beneath the clamps. "Liver laceration, grade 3, Lauren assessed instantly. Pack it." 4 laparotomy sponges, deep and tight. Richard grabbed the thick cotton sponges and packed them brutally hard against the bleeding liver, using sheer pressure to stem the flow. "Now, the vein," Lauren said. She finally let go of the catheter, deflate the balloon, and remove it. The scrub tech quickly deflated the balloon, and Lauren slipped the rubber tube out of the gaping tear in the vein. The vessel was a ragged, terrifying mess. "We can't do a primary repair. The edges are too jagged." "It will stricture," Richard noted, his analytical mind kicking back in. "We need a graft." "We don't have time for a graft harvest. He's been under too long. He's hypothermic and acidotic," Lauren countered instantly. "We do a bovine pericardial patch. Scrub tech, get me a patch. Cut to 3 by 5 centimeters. 50 proline, double-armed, Castroviejo needle holders." What followed was a masterclass in vascular surgery. Richard watched in awe as Lauren sutured the synthetic patch over the gaping hole in the vein. Her movements were incredibly fast, yet flawlessly precise. There was no wasted motion. It was a fluid, hypnotic dance of steel and synthetic thread. She sutured with the rhythm of a metronome, her hands moving with a grace that only comes from thousands of hours of desperate repetition. "How?" Richard whispered, unable to contain himself as he snipped the ends of her sutures. "How do you know how to do this?" Lauren didn't look up. Fallujah, Kabul, Damascus. You learn to fix things fast when the hospital is a tent and the power generator keeps taking mortar fire. She tied the final knot, removed the distal clamp. Richard slowly released the clamp. Blood rushed back into the segment. The patch bulged slightly, but it held. Not a single drop leaked from the suture line. Remove the proximal. The main flow returned. The vein pulsed steadily. The repair was perfect. "He's stable," the anesthesiologist announced, a profound sense of relief washing over his voice. "Pressure is 110/70, heart rate 90. Lauren stepped back from the table. The sudden release of tension hit her physically. Her shoulders slumped, the commanding aura evaporating. She looked down at her hands, covered in another man's blood. The ghosts of the desert receded, leaving behind the exhausted janitor. "Close him up, doctor." "Evans," she said quietly, her voice hoarse. "Leave the liver packed. Bring him back in 48 hours for a washout and definitive closure." Without waiting for a response, Lauren turned, pushed through the double doors, and walked out of the operating room, leaving behind a team of medical professionals utterly paralyzed by what they had just witnessed. Chapter 8. The Interrogation. Richard finished the abdominal closure in a daze. His hands moved mechanically, tying sutures and stapling skin, but his mind was reeling. He had just witnessed the most brilliant, chaotic, and illegal surgical intervention of his life. The moment the patient was wheeled out to the intensive care unit, Richard ripped off his gown and mask, bursting through the OR doors. He practically ran down the hallway, ignoring the questions from his residents. He found her in the basement. The custodial locker room was a dismal, windowless concrete box smelling of damp mops and industrial cleaner. Lauren was sitting on a plastic bench, her blue smock discarded on the floor. She was wearing a plain gray t-shirt, staring blankly at the scarred metal door of her locker. She was trembling slightly, the adrenaline crash leaving her shivering and hollow. Richard stepped into the room, letting the heavy door slam shut behind him. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the cramped space. He wasn't angry, he was desperate for the truth. Lauren slowly looked up. Her hazel eyes were tired, haunted. "Lauren Hayes," she said softly. "Don't give me that." Richard stepped closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over her. "Janitors don't perform balloon tamponades on ruptured vena cavas. Janitors don't suture vascular patches with the speed of a machine. Janitors don't order around chief surgeons. Who are you?" Lauren let out a long, ragged sigh. She rubbed her face with her hands, smearing a faint trace of dried blood across her cheek. The secret was out. The wall had crumbled. There was no point in hiding anymore. "Major Lauren Hayes," she said, her voice monotone, reciting the information like a prisoner of war. "United States Army Medical Corps. Chief Trauma Surgeon, 10th Combat Support Hospital." Richard stared at her, the pieces suddenly clicking into place. The military precision, the unshakable calm under pressure, the intimate knowledge of catastrophic trauma. "You're a combat surgeon," he breathed. "Why? Why are you mopping floors in Chicago?" Lauren looked away, her eyes fixing on a crack in the concrete floor. "Because I'm not allowed to hold a scalpel anymore." Richard sat down heavily on the bench across from her. "Tell me." The story spilled out of her, a dam breaking after years of agonizing silence. She told him about the deployment to a remote forward operating base in Syria. She told him about the day the base was overrun. "We took heavy mortar fire. The main surgical tent collapsed. We moved the wounded to the mess hall." "It was a slaughterhouse," Lauren whispered, her eyes dark with the memory. "I had a young private, 19 years old, shrapnel to the skull. He was herniating, pressure building in his brain. We had no neurosurgeon. We had no drill. If I did nothing, he would be brain dead in 10 minutes. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He knew the desperate, terrifying mathematics of trauma. "So, what did you do?" he asked quietly. "I sent a medic to the motor pool. He brought back a DeWalt power drill," Lauren said, a bitter ghost of a smile touching her lips. I sterilized the drill bit with iodine and fire. I drilled a burr hole into the boy's skull on a cafeteria table, while the building shook from artillery. Richard gasped. A hardware store drill? Good God, Lauren. Did he live? He lived, she said softly. He walked out of Walter Reed 6 months later, but a civilian defense contractor who was sheltering with us reported me, said I was reckless, said I violated protocol and endangered the patient with non-sterile, unapproved equipment. He lived because of you, Richard protested, his outrage flaring. Protocol goes out the window in a combat zone. The medical board back in the States didn't see it that way, Lauren replied, her voice turning cold. They said I was suffering from severe PTSD, that my judgment was fatally compromised. They said I was a liability. They offered me a choice: face a formal court-martial for negligence, or accept a medical discharge and voluntarily surrender my medical license. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I was broken, Richard. I was so tired. I had seen so much death. I didn't have the strength to fight a board of men in suits who had never smelled burning flesh. So, I signed the papers. I walked away. And you came here, Richard said, looking around the dismal locker room, to hide. It was quiet, she said simply. I just wanted to be somewhere quiet, where I couldn't break anyone else. Richard stood up, pacing the narrow aisle between the lockers. His mind was ablaze. The injustice of it was staggering. Here was one of the most brilliant trauma surgeons he had ever seen, scrubbing toilets because she had the courage to do the impossible to save a life. You didn't break anyone tonight, Lauren, Richard said, stopping in front of her. You saved that man's life. I froze. I was going to let him die. You saved him. And committed a felony in the process, Lauren pointed out grimly. Practicing medicine without a license. When the administration finds out what happened in Orwan, they'll call the police. I'll go to jail. Richard looked down at her, a fierce, protective resolve settling over his sharp features. The arrogant golden boy was gone, replaced by a man who had finally met his equal. They aren't going to find out, Richard said, his voice hard as iron. Lauren frowned. There were 4 other people in that room, Richard. The scrub tech, the nurse, the anesthesiologist. Are my team? Richard interrupted. They answer to me, and they know that what you did was a miracle. The official surgical report will state that I performed the balloon tamponade and the vascular repair. You were never in that room. Lauren stood up, shaking her head. No, I won't let you lie for me. If they find out you falsified a surgical report, you'll lose your license, your position as chief, everything. I don't care, Richard said, stepping closer, closing the distance between them. He reached out, gently grasping her arms. I am not letting them bury you again, Lauren. You are a surgeon. It's in your blood. It's in your hands. And the world is too short on miracles to let you spend the rest of your life pushing a mop. Lauren looked up into his eyes. For the first time in 5 years, she didn't see a doctor looking right through her. She saw a man who truly saw her, who understood the weight she carried, and who was willing to risk his own empire to protect her. A tear finally broke free, tracing a clean line down her dusty cheek. Richard raised his hand, his thumb gently wiping it away. The touch was electric, a sudden spark of intense, undeniable connection amidst the sterile, cold reality of the hospital. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Because, Richard said softly, his gaze locked on hers, I think you just saved my life too. Chapter 9. Healing Wounds. The lie held. The surgical team in OR1, fiercely loyal to Richard and profoundly awed by Lauren, agreed to the cover-up. The official record stated that Dr. Richard Evans performed an unorthodox, heroic vascular repair. The patient woke up 3 days later, battered but alive. However, the hospital was a living organism, and rumors were its lifeblood. Whispers began to circulate. The ER nurse in Triage 4 talked about the janitor with the needle. The scrub tech in OR1 drank too much at a bar and muttered about a ghost who stitched veins faster than a machine. A week after the mass casualty event, Richard was summoned to the office of Dr. Marcus Sterling, the imposing silver-haired chief of medicine. Sit down, Richard, Sterling said, steepling his fingers across his heavy mahogany desk. He did not look happy. I'm hearing disturbing rumors regarding the truck driver's surgery, rumors involving a member of the custodial staff. Richard sat in the leather chair, his posture perfect, his face an impassive mask. Rumors are just that, Marcus. The surgical report is clear. The report is a piece of paper, Sterling countered sharply. I have a resident who swears a janitor performed a blind pericardiocentesis in the ER. I have a circulating nurse who looks terrified every time I ask her about the vena cava repair. Richard, if you allowed an unlicensed individual to operate on a patient, I will have your badge, and the hospital will face a catastrophic lawsuit. Richard leaned forward. He had prepared for this moment. He wasn't going to lie anymore, but he wasn't going to surrender either. Her name is Major Lauren Hayes, Richard said, his voice calm and unyielding. She was the chief trauma surgeon for the 10th Combat Support Hospital. She has more experience with catastrophic trauma than every attending in this hospital combined. Sterling's jaw dropped. A combat surgeon? What the hell is she doing mopping floors? She was unjustly forced to surrender her license by a bureaucratic board that didn't understand combat medicine, Richard explained, the passion rising in his voice. When that truck driver started bleeding out, I lost control of the field. I couldn't find the tear. He was going to die on my table, Marcus. She stepped in and saved his life. She saved the little girl in the ER. She didn't practice medicine. She performed a rescue. Sterling rubbed his temples, a headache blooming behind his eyes. Richard, the legal ramifications are irrelevant compared to the moral imperative, Richard interrupted. I will not let her be punished for saving lives. If you fire her, or if you report her, I will resign immediately, and I will take this story to every newspaper in the state. I will tell them that St. Jude's cares more about liability than life. It was a massive gamble. Richard was the star of the hospital, bringing in millions in grants and prestige. Sterling stared at him for a long, tense minute. What do you want, Richard? Sterling finally asked, sounding incredibly tired. I want the hospital's legal team to aggressively petition the medical board to review her case and reinstate her license, Richard demanded. And until then, I want her transferred out of custodial. She will be my personal, non-clinical trauma consultant. She won't touch a patient, but she will be by my side in the OR, advising. Sterling sighed, leaning back in his chair. You are playing with fire, Evans. No, Richard smiled faintly. I'm just finally letting her out of the dark. Later that evening, Richard found Lauren on the roof of the hospital. She had given up her mop. She was standing by the edge, the wind whipping her dark hair around her face, looking out over the glittering skyline of Chicago. Richard walked up beside her, leaning against the cold concrete parapet. He handed her a paper coffee cup. No mop tonight? He asked softly. Miller fired me, Lauren said, though she didn't sound upset. Said I was fraternizing with the doctors. Well, Miller is an idiot. Richard laughed softly. He turned to look at her. The haunted look in her eyes had receded, replaced by a cautious, fragile hope. Sterling agreed. The hospital lawyers are filing the appeal tomorrow. They think with my backing, and the sealed records of the lives you saved this week, they can get the board to reverse the decision. Lauren closed her eyes, letting out a breath that seemed to carry 5 years of grief with it. I don't know if I'm ready, Richard. To hold the scalpel again. To hold the responsibility. Richard reached out, his hand covering hers on the cold concrete. His grip was warm, strong, and grounding. You don't have to do it alone. You're going to be my consultant. You're going to stand right next to me. We'll do it together. Lauren opened her eyes and looked at him. The arrogant surgeon she had observed from the shadows was gone. In his place was a partner, a man who had seen her at her most broken and recognized her true strength. She turned her hand over, intertwining her fingers with his. The physical contact sent a jolt of warmth through her chest, healing a wound that she thought would bleed forever. Okay, Lauren whispered, a genuine, beautiful smile breaking across her face for the first time in half a decade. Together, they stood there on the roof, two brilliant scarred surgeons looking out at the city. The storm had passed. The sky was clear, and for the first time in a very long time, Lauren Hayes wasn't invisible anymore. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Lauren's journey reminds us that true brilliance and courage cannot be permanently hidden, no matter how heavy the weight of the past. It's a powerful testament to the fact that trauma does not define our value, and that sometimes the most profound healing comes when we allow ourselves to step out of the shadows and let others help us carry the burden. It shows us that true heroes don't always wear capes or pristine white coats. Sometimes they wear blue polyester and carry a mop, waiting for the right moment to change the world. If this story of redemption hidden strength, and second chances moved you, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that their past does not dictate their future, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping, emotional stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit.